This is a story about Appalachian quilting, but it's not the story you might expect. It's not about pretty patterns in museum displays or folk art selling for thousands at auction. This is about survival, about creativity born from desperation, about women who turned poverty into warmth, scraps into beauty, and making do into an art form. Welcome back to Legends from the Holler. Today we are going to be talking about quilting and how important they were, as well as how they were made from materials that otherwise had become too worn for use. The winter of 1932 hit the Cumberland Gap harder than most. Mabel Curtis was 23 years old with 3 babies under 5, a husband working the coal mines when there was work to be had, and a drafty cabin that couldn't seem to hold heat no matter how much wood they burned. She told this story sitting in her kitchen while she pieced together scraps of fabric on her lap. Her hands never stopped moving as she talked, the needle flashing in and out like it had a mind of its own. "We didn't have nothing," she said, not with bitterness, but as simple fact. "But we had each other, and we had what we could make with our own 2 hands." That winter, she made a quilt from the worn-out overalls she could no longer patch for her husband, the flour sacks she'd been saving, the faded dresses her girls had outgrown, and from a tablecloth her mother had given her when she married. Already threadbare even then, she called it her necessity quilt, and it kept those 3 babies warm through a winter that claimed lives across the mountains. To understand Appalachian quilting, you have to understand what life was actually like in these mountains. We're talking about a region that spans from southern New York down to northern Mississippi. Millions of acres of steep, isolated hollers where communities could be cut off for months at a time. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, most mountain families lived in what we'd now call extreme poverty. A typical family might survive on less than $300 a year in cash money, equivalent to maybe $5,000 today. But even that number doesn't capture it, because most folks barely saw cash at all. They lived on barter, trade, and what they could grow, hunt, or make themselves. Women in these communities were responsible for clothing their entire families. Think about that for a moment. Not going to the store and buying clothes, making every single garment from scratch, the spinning, the weaving, the cutting, the sewing, every shirt, every pair of pants, every dress, every blanket. Fabric was precious, unbelievably precious. A woman might spin for 3 weeks to make enough thread for one dress. Store-bought cloth was a luxury most families couldn't afford, and when they could buy it, they bought the cheapest, often rough, low-quality material that would wear out quickly. So when something wore out, you didn't throw it away. You couldn't. You saved every scrap. My great-great-grandmother kept a scrap bag hanging on a nail beside her fireplace. Every time something tore beyond repair, she'd cut off the buttons to save, cut off any good sections of fabric, and add them to that bag. Flour sacks, feed sacks, worn-out clothes, any fabric that passed through her hands, if it had life left in it, it went in that bag. This wasn't hoarding. This was survival. Because when winter came, and winters in the mountains were brutal, those scraps became quilts. And quilts were often the only thing standing between a family and freezing to death. There's a romanticism around quilting today. We see it as a craft, a hobby, something grandmothers do for love and leisure. And sure, there was love in these quilts, mountains of love, but there was also desperation. A family in the mountains needed multiple quilts just to survive. 3 or 4 per bed wasn't unusual. Houses had gaps in the walls where chinking had fallen out. Windows were often just shutters with no glass. Heat came from a single fireplace that might serve for cooking, heating, and light. On the coldest nights, families would hang quilts over doorways and windows, creating smaller spaces they could actually keep warm. The quilts themselves were rarely the beautiful, intricate patterns we see in museums. Those fancy quilts, your Star of Bethlehem, your double wedding ring, those took planning. Matching fabrics, time, and resources most mountain women simply didn't have. Instead, they made utility quilts, Crazy quilts were popular not because they were stylish, but because you could use every oddly shaped scrap. Strip quilts worked well because you could sew long strips of different fabrics together without worrying about creating a pattern. String quilts used the narrowest scraps, pieces so thin they might otherwise be worthless, sewn onto a foundation fabric. The backing was often made from feed sacks or flour sacks. Companies started printing these sacks with patterns once they realized mountain women were using them for clothing and quilts. These sacks, made of sturdy cotton, became the primary free fabric source. Women would choose brands like Martha White or Gold Medal, not for the flower inside, but for the floral print on the outside. A whole dress or a quilt backing meant saving up dozens of identical sacks. Women would save up to buy the same brand of flour repeatedly just to get enough. The batting, the middle layer that provides warmth, was whatever they had. Old blankets that were falling apart, worn-out quilts layered inside, new ones, cotton from their own fields if they grew it. Sometimes just extra layers of fabric scraps. In the poorest families, dried leaves or corn shucks, and they quilted by hand, because that's all there was. Sewing machines were rare and expensive. Even if you had one, you might not have money for thread, so you quilted with whatever thread you could get, sometimes unraveling old clothes to get thread to sew new things. The quilting itself was done with large utilitarian stitches. Not the tiny precise stitches of show quilts, but practical stitches meant to hold the layers together through hard use. These quilts would be used for everything, including sleeping under. They'd be dragged outside for picnics, used to wrap around children playing in snow, spread on the ground during revival meetings. They needed to be sturdy, not necessarily beautiful, though often they were beautiful anyway. Here's something that surprised me when I really started researching this. Quilting bees in Appalachia weren't quite like the social gatherings we imagine. Yes, women did gather to quilt together, but it wasn't usually leisurely. It was practical efficiency. One woman with a quilt frame set up in her cabin might invite neighbors to help finish a quilt top she'd already pieced together. With multiple women working, they could finish quilting in a day, something that might take one woman weeks of evening work by lamplight. The large quilting frame was too bulky for most cabins, so it was often lowered from the ceiling when not in use. When it was down, it took up the whole room, making collaboration absolutely necessary. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They were work parties, yes, but also rare social opportunities for women who might live miles from their nearest neighbor. They were information exchanges. News, gossip, advice on everything from doctoring to preserving food. They were support networks where women helped each other survive. Sometimes a bee was called specifically to help someone in need. If a woman was sick, if there'd been a death in the family, if someone was preparing to marry, the community would gather to help produce the quilts needed. A new bride might receive several quilts from the women of her community. Not as pretty gifts, but as necessary household goods that would literally keep her family alive. The gatherings weren't always gentle or peaceful either. Mountain women had strong opinions and weren't shy about sharing them. My grandmother told me about bees that ended in hurt feelings because someone criticized another woman's stitching or choice of fabrics, but they'd still show up next time because they needed each other. Young girls learned to quilt the way they learned everything else, by watching and doing. A 4-year-old might practice with scraps and a threaded needle. By 7 or 8, she'd be piecing simple blocks. By her early teens, she'd be expected to contribute real work to the family's quilting. Many girls made their first quilts entirely by themselves around age 12 or 13. This wasn't child labor in the exploitative sense. This was survival skills taught young because they'd need them their entire lives. Now, despite the utilitarian reality of most mountain quilting, patterns did matter. They mattered deeply. Some patterns were practical choices. Like I mentioned, crazy quilts and strip quilts made sense when you had odd scraps. But women also chose patterns that carried meaning or told stories. The log cabin pattern was popular partly because it used strips efficiently, but also because it symbolized home and hearth. The center square often represented the fireplace, the logs building out from there. Some women made these with a red center for warmth and prosperity, others with black to commemorate a death. Bear's paw patterns appeared in regions where hunting was crucial to survival. Pine tree patterns honored the forests that provided timber, fuel, and food. Jacob's ladder reflected the deep religious faith that sustained mountain communities through hardship. But here's what's important. These patterns weren't standardized. A woman might learn a pattern from her mother or neighbor, but then adapt it based on what scraps she had. She might know it by a different name. What one community called monkey wrench, another called hole in the barn door. The pattern itself mattered less than the fact that she could make something coherent and useful from her scraps. Some of the most moving quilts I've seen are what I call memory quilts, made from the clothes of people who died. A mother would save pieces of her child's dress. A widow would incorporate her husband's shirt. These quilts kept the dead close, literally wrapping survivors in the physical fabric of their loved ones' lives. This wasn't just sentimental, it was practical. Good fabric was too valuable to bury, but keeping these pieces and using them honored the dead while serving the living. The mid-20th century brought massive changes to Appalachia. Electrification reached more remote areas, roads improved. Manufactured goods became cheaper and more accessible. The welfare system, whatever its flaws, provided a basic safety net that hadn't existed before. For quilting, this meant a fundamental shift. Women could buy blankets at the store, cheap, mass-produced blankets that were often warmer than homemade quilts. They could buy clothes ready-made. Sewing machines became common. Later, central heating meant you didn't need 4 quilts per bed just to survive the night. Quilting began to change from necessity to choice, from survival to craft, from urgent to optional. Some women kept quilting because they loved it, because it connected them to their mothers and grandmothers, because they found satisfaction in creating beauty from scraps. But for many, once they didn't have to quilt, they didn't. Can you blame them? When you've spent your whole life making do because you had no choice, maybe you want to enjoy having choices. But something was lost in that transition. Not just the quilts themselves, though many were lost. Worn out, discarded, sold for nothing at yard sales before anyone understood their value. But the knowledge and the skills, the understanding of what it means to truly make do, to create from almost nothing, to find abundance in scarcity, Appalachian quilting wasn't romantic. It was hard. Exhausting work done by women who were already doing endless hard, exhausting work just to keep their families alive. They weren't making art, though they made art anyway. They weren't preserving traditions, though they preserved traditions anyway. They were surviving, but in that survival, they created something remarkable, a practical art that said, we may not have much, but we'll make something from what we have. We'll take the worn out and broken and piece it into something new. We'll make do and we'll make it beautiful. Today, people quilt for pleasure. They buy fat quarters at craft stores, use rotary cutters and templates, follow patterns from books and YouTube videos. There's nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful that quilting can be chosen rather than required, art rather than necessity. But I think we should remember where it came from. Remember the women who quilted by firelight after working from dawn to dusk? Remember that every scrap represented something. A worn-out dress, a child's outgrown pants, a husband's shirt that couldn't be patched anymore. Remember that these quilts were literally the difference between warmth and cold, between comfort and suffering, sometimes between life and death. Make do and mend. That was the rule that governed Appalachian life for generations. Waste not, want not, though that was part of it. But make do, work with what you have, create from what others would throw away. Find abundance in scarcity. In a world of abundance and waste, maybe we need that wisdom again. Maybe we need to remember what our grandmothers knew, that creativity blooms in constraint, that beauty can come from scraps, that making do isn't settling. It's a kind of magic all its own. The practical art of Appalachian quilting isn't dead. It lives in every quilter who pieces scraps, in every person who looks at something worn out and sees possibility, in everyone who knows that the most precious things are often made from what we already have. Thank you for watching Legends from the Holler. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single video. Some are informative, others are spooky. However, they are all about Appalachia.